Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about surface area to volume ratios, in particular with regard to cells. But before I get into that discussion, I want to ask you a simple question. Have you ever thought about how many cells make up your body? So how many cells comprise a typical human body? That's what I want to pose that question. And what's interesting about that question is it seems like a simple enough question that would require a simple answer, but I'm not sure if I could provide it. All I'll say is the fact that you know that there's a lot. And if you did some calculations and said, well, how much does a typical cell weigh? And you're like, well, a cell weighs 1 nanogram. And if a typical adult body weighs around 70 kilograms, if you did the math, you might say, well, there might be 70 trillion cells in the body. It's a lot. But there's other estimates. It's difficult to count. I mean, if you were to try to count them, it would take thousands of years to literally do that, and you'd have to cut yourself up in many tiny pieces, look under the microscope. But the cells are spaced out. They have different dispersion patterns, and there's slightly different volumes, and so it's difficult to say. So the best guess I can come up with is approximately 37, 40 trillion cells, so around 40 trillion cells. And so that's an interesting thought, but this video is not necessarily about that per se, but the reason why there's so many cells and why they're so small. And that has to do with surface area to volume ratios. Okay, here you have a typical cube right here, and that's going to represent this cube with 6 sides that are all equal sizes because it's a perfect cube. That's the sides of this cube are going to represent the cell membrane or the plasma membrane of a typical cell. And we're going to call this the surface area. In other words, all the area that comprises this. For example, if I were to shade in the top like this and shade in the bottom side like this, you might realize that if you took this cube apart, it would look something like this. You would have like a rectangle like that, and then you would have, for example, the top and the bottom like that. And let me shade it in to represent the bottom and the top like that. And then you would break this up into, the best I can, 4 parts. And so you'd have 6 sides that make up this cube. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is what I mean by surface area, and it's representing the cell membrane. Well, we also have the substance within the cell. In other words, all the fluid, the semi-fluid technically, material that comprises the internal matrix of the cell, and that's referred to as the cytosol, or cell solution, or cytoplasm, or cell liquid. And that's the volume. And so this particular discussion I'm going to help you determine how to calculate surface area of a cube and how to calculate the volume of a cube, in other words, the volume of a cell. And then I want to look at surface area to volume ratios, especially as the cell gets larger. And I hope to convince you that you'll find that it's far more efficient for cells to be small than they are to be large. Okay, spoiler alert. Okay, so just a little close-up of the cell membrane. You might be familiar with the cell membrane. Cell membrane is made up of a classic phospholipid bilayer. It's semi-permeable. It allows small molecules to pass in fairly readily, especially nonpolar ones like oxygen. And so this is basically, why would I bring this up? Because this is kind of really what we're trying to talk about. Like if oxygen is passing by a cell, for example, in a blood vessel, in a red blood cell, it's very, very important for oxygen to be able to diffuse into the cell. So there needs to be enough surface area to accommodate that. And so the volume shouldn't be so large so that the oxygen wouldn't be enough. And so also there needs to be exchange via diffusion of carbon dioxide. And so this diffusion is really important between the outside environment and the inside environment, and that's why those ratios need to be favorable for the cell. Okay, and so you might say to yourself, I'm not too particularly I don't have a background per se on what cells look like. Well, they take on a lot of different shapes, but I'm going to discuss this sort of cube-shaped cell, if you will. And you're like, well, is there a cell really like this? There are. There are cells in the body, for example, they're actually called cuboidal, of all things. So there's a picture of them right here. If I were to trace that like that. So these cells are cube-like. And if you wanted to get into cells that are similar, we call those tissues, and cells that are in contact with free space or epithelium. And then since they're only one cell thick, we call those simple cuboidal epithelium. But that's another video. Let's try to calculate the volume of this cube, and let's try to calculate the surface area. And so what I'm trying to relate, again, is the cell and the cube are going to be similar this way. So let's go ahead and do that. You might be familiar with this, that the volume of a cube is equal to the length times the width times the height. Okay, so for example, if I throw in some numbers here and I said that if I were to measure this with my ruler and I'd say that this is 1 centimeter and let me go over here so you can see it, this is 1 centimeter, the height, and then over here is 1 centimeter. I would just simply multiply those together in order to determine my volume. Okay, so if the volume is 1 centimeter, as I was saying, the units are going to be in centimeter cubed. So to do the math on it, I would say volume is equal to 1 times 1 times 1, which of course equals 1. So the volume would be 1 centimeter cubed. Okay, seems straightforward enough, right? Okay, so the surface area, however, of the cube, let's go ahead and look at that. Surface area of the cube, a cube again with 1 centimeter. The surface area formula is length times width. Okay, so that's going to go 1 over here times 1 over here. But there's 6 sides. If you recall earlier in the video, I demonstrated that. And so if I said 1 times 1 and then times 6 would be, of course, 6. And so the surface area would be 6, and the units would be in centimeters squared. Okay, so when you put those two things together, if I were interested in determining the ratio of surface area to volume, because I am, surface area to volume, I would say that there's a 6 surface area and the volume of 1. So it's 6 to 1 is the ratio in a cube of 1 centimeter. Okay, 6 to 1. And so surface area to volume ratio, okay, so surface area over volume is going to be 6 to 1. Okay, so let's take a look now and see what would happen if the cell gets a little larger. So there's a question. So surface area to volume, will it change? So let's look at a cell that's twice the size, 2 centimeters. So it's 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter. Okay, so again, the volume is, if I were going to do that calculation with you, the volume is going to be length times width times height. Okay, and so and again, the volume size is 2. So what I'm going to do there is go 2 times 2, which is 4, times 2, which is 8. So the volume is 8 centimeter cube, okay, for the volume. Now surface area, again, we're going to calculate that, and it's length times width. So length times width, it'll be 2 times 2 is 4. Again, times 6 is 24. Oh, okay, so, and this is centimeter cube. So if I'm interested in the surface area, it's 24 centimeter square. I made a sub cube, I meant to say square. So the ratio of surface area to volume, so it's 24 over 8. Let's take a look at that. So 24 over 8. Let me erase that. So the surface area to volume is 24 over 8. And if I reduce that, this is the cube of 2 centimeters. And then let's do cube of 1 centimeter, if you remember that. Surface area to volume is 6 over 1. Now, if I were to reduce that, I would come up with 3 to 1. Okay? So what's interesting about this, just for a second to sort of analyze this, you can see how there's a greater surface area to volume ratio, 6 to 1. Now, but what's remarkable to me is, do you see here how the surface area is increasing right here 4 times? The surface area is increasing 4 times, but the volume is increasing more. The volume is increasing 8 times more in a larger cube. So as the volume gets larger, the surface area isn't able to match it. The surface area isn't able to get in the proper nutrients necessary, like, for example, oxygen. Now, it's not to say that the oxygen can't diffuse into a larger cell, but there's so much volume that it takes a longer time for oxygen to diffuse into the entire huge volume of that cell. And so let's continue. It might be totally clear now, but let me go with you one more example, if you don't mind, and say what happens if we go 3. And so again, the volume, let's do this together. The volume is length times width times height. So if you did this, you can do, let's see, 3 times 3 is 9 times 3 equals 27. So you have 27 cube. And then surface area over here, again, is length times width. So length times width is going to be 3 times 3, which is 9, like that, and then times 6 sides, and that's going to be 54. Yeah, okay, so surface area, again, is in centimeter. This is surface area, is in centimeter square. So if you do the ratio of surface area to volume, you would have 54 over 27. And if you reduce that to 6 over 3, which then can be reduced to 2 over 1. Okay? So you could see here that, again, the volume is increasing much more dramatically than the surface area is able to accommodate. And so it's very crucial that the surface area to volume ratio gets smaller when cells get larger. And so cells prefer, they don't just prefer consciously, but they survive better when their surface area to volume ratio is high. And so therefore, in order to get a high surface area, cells must be smaller in terms of, they would therefore have greater surface area than volume. And so, you know, you could solve this. Like, you could say, well, the small cell is going to have a better surface area to volume than the big guy. And you're like, okay. But you still want to have, for example, a larger organism is going to have a larger volume. But you could solve this problem by having a large organism be composed of small individual cells. So there it is. The surface area increases while the volume remains constant. If you divide it up into, see, this way there's more surface area between the sides, if you can see that. Oxygen's able to get into in all these crevices. And so smaller cells have a greater surface area to volume ratio. And so, again, you know, one of the great organisms of the world, largest tree, the great sequoia, you know, it's huge. Does it have huge cells? No, it does not have huge cells, because it wouldn't be able to handle it. And so even a big organism has small cells, and even a tiny guy like an ant is going to have tiny cells. It's just that the big organism has more. And it has to do with the rate of chemical exchange, diffusion, like, for example, oxygen. And so the need for surface is sufficiently large to accommodate the volume explains why cells are microscopic. Okay, I hope that was good. And so larger organisms generally don't have larger cells, but they just have more of them. And so I also want to mention, in addition to surface area in terms of small cells versus large cells, sometimes the plasma membrane itself, this is a typical cell, Sometimes the plasma membrane itself, check this out, has even extensions of the cell membrane. So, for example, if you had a string like this at this length, and if I had another string and I folded it like this, in other words, I made it really convoluted, and then I was able to pull that string apart and tease it out, it would be even longer still, so there'd be more surface area. And so cells have extensions of their plasma membrane that further increase surface area if the cell is specialized in order to receive or disseminate, in other words, secrete or absorb material. Another example of surface area to volume is our intestines. I'm not sure if you realize it, but your small intestines are really long. They're many meters in length, and that length also increases the surface area outright in order for cells to absorb materials. But when you look inside, like obviously, if you didn't know, food is traveling through your small intestine, so it needs to be absorbed into these blood vessels and then travel to the rest of the body. The surface area of your small intestine, if you were to just open it all up, is 300 meters squared. 300 meters squared. That's incredible. That's like the surface area of a tennis court in your body. I'm like, whoa. Well, here's the food. This is sort of a look inside the small intestine. The food's traveling in here, and the goal, again, is to be absorbed through diffusion into the bloodstream. But not only are the cells very small. If I were to draw in the cells, they would be like this. If I were to put in little tiny cells, you wouldn't even be able to see them. I have another picture coming that's better. But check this out. The inner folds of the small intestine there's actual extensions. So it's like carpet or like little fingers sticking out, and it's called villi. And that further increases the surface area. So when the food passes through your small intestine, it doesn't cruise down like water through a hose. It's almost like an egg carton where the food is just slowly meandering through up and down these mountains. And so there's even more surface area caused by these villi. And so if you get, this is the picture that I was talking about. If you look at the villi, you'll look closely and you can see here are the individual cells. So this villi increases surface area, as well as the cells being small increases surface area, as well as each individual cell has a convoluted plasma membrane called microvilli, sometimes known as brush border, meaning like a comb has those little projections sticking out. So brush border or microvilli. So pretty cool to increase surface area. This is what the villi actually look like under the light microscope at approximately 400 magnification. You can see individual cells here. Maybe you can, maybe can't. The little dark spots are the nuclei. This is the epithelial tissue. These sort of hollow-looking cells secrete mucus to the outside to help hydrolyze the food, and then when it's small enough into monomers, it then diffuses into each of these cells. And so the food is what we're talking about. Like, for example, glucose. If glucose is out here, it's going to then diffuse into these tiny cells because of the villi and because of the microvilli. So pretty cool. And then one last example, some cells, to even further increase surface area, are flat. And so instead of a cell being a cube, a cell could be more like a pancake, or even still like a crepe. So a flat cell, if you push it down, it's going to have the same surface area as a cube. It's going to have the same volume, but it's going to have a greater surface area if it's flat. And so the cells that make up our capillaries are flat. They look like this. And again, it's hard to see that, but if you took a crepe and another crepe and made a tube out of it, that's what capillaries look like. And then one of my favorites is the red blood cell itself. So these guys that carry oxygen inside the capillary, right there. Like when you look at these guys under the scanning electron microscope, they're flat. And so flat, the shape, allows for greater diffusion of oxygen from the red blood cell into the tissue. And that is why capillaries in the lung, this is a picture of a cross-section of a alveolar air sac inside your lung. The air sacs themselves are made up of these flattened cells. And when I say flat, it's sort of like tile. That's what I'm thinking of right here. Or again, a crepe. And if you folded those over and made a ball, that would be filled with air or oxygen right in here. And then that would easily diffuse across the cell. And those cells are called simple because they're a single layer, and they're called squamous for being flat. So that's kind of cool. And then the final example is one of my favorite organs of the body is the kidney. And the kidney, as you may or may not know, helps to filter waste from the blood and help us to stay healthy. And it does that, and these are capillaries right here. It does that by a lot of pressure. And so fluid gets pushed out of our bloodstream, and it goes into this capsule right here. This is called a glomerulus, and this is the Bowman's capsule. But what I want to show you is that these cells are very flat right here. These are also those simple squamous cells right there. There's the nucleus. Here is another one right there. And so diffusion readily occurs because the cells are flat and they're small, which increases surface area. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this particular video on surface area to volume ratios. Thanks for watching.